In the land of Sparta, where boys were taught to fight before they could speak and honor was carved in bone, women were no less fierce. Among them was one whose name echoed through the marble halls like the clash of steel. Leonthe, daughter of Commander Adrastos. She was born during a blood-red eclipse as omens howled over the city. Midwives whispered that she came from Ares himself. By age 12, she had bested her brothers in the wrestling ring. By 16, she had led a hunting party into the Taygetus Mountains and returned with 3 wild boars tied behind her chariot. Leonthe was not just respected, she was feared. She walked through the Spartan agora with a straight spine and quiet steps. Men lowered their eyes. Women watched her with a strange mix of envy and awe. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, and her words were chosen like arrows, never wasted. But there was something in her that few noticed. When she removed her armor at night, when the torches dimmed and the world outside fell away, Leonthe would stare at the stars, not with a warrior's challenge, but with wonder. There was a softness buried in her, one that battle could not scorch. A yearning, not for marriage, not for conquest, but for something else, something the Spartan code had no name for. Peace, magic, mystery. She never said. What she knew was this. Every full moon, when the city slowed and the warriors slept, her body pulled her toward the cliffs above the river Eurotas. She would leave behind her spear, her cuirass, her reputation, and become just a woman wandering beneath the stars alone. The world, she thought, must be bigger than Sparta, bigger than swords and pride. She felt it in her blood, like music she couldn't hear but knew was playing somewhere. And then one night, beneath a sky so silver it looked scraped from the edge of a blade, she saw it gliding across a still pool in a hidden grove. A swan unmoving watching her, moonlight rippling on its back, beautiful in a way no war song had ever been. And from that moment on, Leonthe's life began to shift away from blood and battle towards something softer, stranger, and far more dangerous. The grove was hidden, untouched by the usual grit of Spartan boots. Nestled between 2 cliffs, it whispered of something older than Sparta, older even than Olympus. The trees curved in crescent arches, their branches low and silvered by moonlight. A shallow lake lay at the center, still as glass, and on it, the swan. Its feathers shimmered like woven starlight, neither white nor gray, but something in between. It floated with the silence of smoke, cutting across the water with no ripple. Its long neck arched gracefully as if sculpted by divine hands, and its eyes, God's, its eyes, held no animal wildness, no fear, only awareness. Leonthe froze at the tree line. Her training screamed caution. Nothing in nature moved like this. No creature stood so boldly before a human. But the swan did not flee. It watched her calmly, expectantly. She stepped forward. It tilted its head. Another step closer. The lake did not stir. She stood at the edge of the water, heartbeat steady but alert, hand resting lightly on the dagger strapped to her thigh. The swan moved again, slowly, deliberately, toward her. When it reached the edge of the shallows, it stopped and bowed its head slightly. Leonthe knelt. She had seen thousands of things in her life. War camps burning, bloodied warriors screaming at the heavens, newborn calves gasping for their first breath. But never had she seen something so quiet, so still, so enchanted. She reached out. The swan did not resist. Her fingertips brushed its feathers, warm, unnaturally warm, as though its body burned with sunlight instead of blood. A feeling stirred in her chest. Not fear, not fascination, something older, something she didn't know she'd been missing until that very moment. Connection. The swan blinked once and turned away, gliding back into the center of the lake. Leonthe remained kneeling, watching it, unsure what had just begun, but certain it was no accident. The next full moon, she returned. So did the swan, and again the next month and the next. No words, no promises, just presence. A ritual born of silence and gravity. By the time autumn settled on the hills, Leonthe no longer questioned why. She just knew the swan would be waiting, and her world would never be the same. Seasons turned. Leaves greened, fell, and grew again. The wars continued far below the hills, but in that moonlit grove, time stood still. Only the full moons mattered now, only those nights. Leonthi had once measured her worth in battle scars, victories, and commands followed without hesitation. But now something softer guided her, something far older than Spartan law. Each month she returned to the grove with offerings, fresh figs, soft linens, carved trinkets from olive wood. The swan never ate, never acknowledged the gifts. Yet Leonthi continued, drawn by an instinct she couldn't explain. The swan was always waiting. It met her at the edge of the water, dipped its head gently, then glided by her side. Sometimes it circled her. Sometimes it simply stood beside her on the shore, its warmth bleeding into the air around it like a hidden sun. She began to speak, not like a soldier, but like a woman who had never been heard before. She spoke of her father's coldness, of how victory never filled the empty space in her chest, of the nights she stared at the sky, wondering if there was more than sword and soil. The swan said nothing, but it listened. She could feel it. Its stillness wasn't silence. It was attention, the kind mortals never gave, the kind no commander, no suitor, no friend had ever offered her. Over time, she stopped feeling alone. She braided her hair before each visit, smoothed her robes, sat beside the swan for hours, shoulder-touching wing, saying little, yet feeling more than she'd ever felt in a Spartan palace or battlefield. And still, the swan never fled, never aged, never changed. She should have been afraid. There were stories of gods taking animal form to lure mortals into ruin, stories of punishments for those who loved the divine. But Leonthi didn't believe in stories anymore. She believed in the way her hand fit perfectly along the curve of the swan's neck, in the way it bowed its head when she sang quietly into the night, in the way it seemed to wait for her, need her. No words, no promises. But in their silence, something ancient took root, and though she didn't speak the word, not even to herself, Leonthi knew what it was. Love. The swan was not born of earth. Its wings had once stretched across the sky. Its fingers had played the lyre that made the sun rise. Its name had once been whispered in temples, carved in marble, and shouted in song. Apollo, god of light, of music, of now silent, feathered, bound. Long before Leonthi was born, Apollo had committed a sin in the eyes of Olympus. He had defied Zeus, not with blade or rebellion, but with truth. He had spoken against his father's punishments, against the cruelty passed down from throne to world, against the silence demanded by power. For this, Zeus did not kill him. He unmade him, a spell cast in fury more cursed than justice. Apollo was stripped of his form, his voice, his divinity, forced into the body of a swan. Not to teach him humility, but to remind him he could glow like the sun and still be caged by shadow. The curse was crueler still. There was one condition. If a mortal ever discovered his true identity, the transformation would become permanent. And so Apollo waited years, centuries, lifetimes, floating on lakes, hiding beneath stars, watching mortals forget his temples, forget his hymns, watching the world grow colder as the gods withdrew. Until Leonthi, her presence cracked something inside him, something buried so deep even Olympus had forgotten it existed. Hope. He never meant to be seen, never meant to stay. But she returned again and again. And her voice, when she spoke to him in the glade, was the only thing that made the fire inside him flicker again. She was not a priestess, not a nymph, not a chosen oracle. She was a warrior with hands that knew only weapons, a woman hardened by loss and trained to feel nothing. And yet she saw him. She treated him not as a symbol or a threat, but as something sacred, something worth waiting for. He dared not speak, dared not reveal his name, but in the tilt of his head, in the stillness of his body, he answered every question she never asked. And slowly, impossibly, he loved her back. In Sparta, solitude was respected, but not for too long. Leonthi's absence did not go unnoticed. Each full moon she slipped away from the barracks, from the training fields, from the watchful eyes of commanders and kin. At first, none questioned her. She was Leonthe, untouchable, unshakable, the warrior whose loyalty was carved into every scar. But Sparta thrived on order, on discipline and love, especially the hidden kind, was a foreign thing in a city built on control. Whispers began, she wanders, she speaks less in counsel, she trains, but her strikes lack venom. It was true, Leonthe had changed. Her movements were still sharp, but no longer cruel. Her voice no longer cut, and something in her eyes softened. Some nights she smiled to herself, as if holding a secret the gods themselves couldn't steal. Her father noticed first. Commander Adrastos, a man whose face bore no softness, whose daughters were meant to lead men, not follow feelings. He summoned her one evening under the guise of strategy. But when the chamber emptied, he spoke plainly. "What keeps you from sleep?" Leonthe offered no answer. His voice darkened. "Do not forget who you are." But she already had, at least the version of herself that Sparta had molded. What the city had built in stone, the swan had touched with water, and Leonthe found herself unwilling to return to who she'd been. Still, Sparta watched. A patrol once followed her out beyond the walls, tracing her steps toward the cliffs. They lost her near the olive groves. She was too skilled to be shadowed, but it was enough to birth suspicion. Priests murmured about omens, that the moonlight carried voices, that the lakes beyond Sparta stirred unnaturally, a warrior woman disappearing each full moon. They feared it was madness, or worse, a god. Leonthe knew the walls were closing in, that eyes were learning to look where before they had looked away, that her silence, once strength, now made her vulnerable. But still she went, still she found him. And in that grove where moonlight touched feather, she forgot the noise of Sparta, forgot the rules, forgot the danger. Only one thing mattered now, not being seen. Because if the world discovered what she knew in her heart, it would destroy them both. The moon was heavy that night, low, swollen, golden as a dying flame. Leonthe stood in her chamber, fingers trembling over her armor, unable to fasten the final clasp. Something had changed. She had felt it for days, a quiet trembling beneath her feet, like the ground itself knew what she did not. The swan had been different on their last meeting, restless, more watchful. Its feathers bristled when the wind shifted. It had circled her twice before settling at her side, its warmth sharp instead of soothing. That night, sleep eluded her, and when it came, it brought visions. She stood in a silver grove, her hands covered in gold dust. A statue loomed before her, part man, part swan, its wings frozen mid-beat, its face serene and lifeless. She reached out, called a name she didn't know she knew. Apollo. The statue cracked and a voice echoed, not from the sky, but from inside her bones. Truth will freeze what love has kindled. She awoke breathless, heart racing, the name still burning on her tongue. She tried to dismiss it, a dream, nothing more. But warriors know when fear is real, and this was no ordinary omen. This was prophecy. The next day, Leonthe left Sparta earlier than usual, the ache in her chest sharper with every step. She didn't follow her usual path. Her feet led her deeper into the hills, through trees she'd never passed, into groves untouched by memory. There, hidden beneath a curtain of ivy and moss, she found the altar, ancient, cracked, marked with a single unmistakable inscription carved in old flaking gold. Apollo, her breath hitched. All at once, the pieces fell into place. The warmth of the swan, its listening gaze, the dreams, the curse in her bones, the reason it had always come during the full moon. He wasn't just enchanted. He was a god, her god, and she had broken something. She stumbled back, the sound of feathers behind her. The swan had followed her, silent as always, but its stillness no longer comforted her. It was watching sadly, softly, as if it already knew, as if the truth had arrived. And so had the end. The grove was no longer still. The air pulsed slow and deep, like the breath of something ancient stirring in its sleep. Moonlight trembled on the surface of the lake. The trees leaned in, silent witnesses to the unraveling of a secret that had survived centuries. Leonthe stood frozen before the altar. The name Apollo still echoed in her mind like a spear striking stone. She turned slowly as if doing so would unmake the truth. But it was too late. The swan was there, not gliding, not graceful, just standing, watching. Its feathers no longer shimmered. Its glow dimmed, flickering like a dying flame. Leonthi stepped toward it, her lips parted, unsure what to say, unsure if anything could be said. "I know," she whispered. The wind stilled. A single feather drifted from the swan's back, falling slowly, silently, before vanishing into dust the moment it touched the altar. And then the change began. The swan's neck arched, not in grace, but in agony. Its body trembled. Feathers unraveled into streams of gold and light. Wings bent into arms. Webbed feet split into toes that dug into the earth and where the swan had stood. Now knelt a man, naked, radiant, broken Apollo. His hair shimmered like the sky at dawn. His skin glowed faintly like embers beneath marble. But his eyes were dimmed by sorrow, by inevitability. Leonthi stepped back, hand to her mouth. She had loved him in silence, and now silence had become unbearable. He tried to speak, but the curse had not fully lifted. His voice cracked like thunder in a storm too old to name. "You weren't supposed to know," he said at last, voice barely more than wind. It was the only rule. She fell to her knees beside him, tears cutting down her warrior's face like rivers through mountain stone. "I didn't mean to," she whispered. He smiled then just once, a god smile, not of joy but of farewell, "I know." And with that, the ground beneath them shuddered. A soundless quake. A divine sentence passed without mercy. His glow faded, his skin hardened, his limbs stiffened mid-reach. Apollo was turning to stone, and Leonthi could only watch as love became legend. The moment the name was spoken, the curse began its final work. Apollo's body, once fluid with divinity, now stiffened inch by inch. The light beneath his skin dulled like cooling metal. His golden hair lost its luster, hardening into marble threads as the final phase of Zeus's punishment took hold. There would be no forgiveness, no reprieve. Leonthi grasped his hands, still warm, still trembling, but she could feel it, the stone creeping like frost over flesh. His fingers curled around hers one last time before they stopped moving altogether. She shook her head. No, this can't be how it ends. But the curse didn't listen. It had waited centuries in silence, patient and cruel. Apollo's chest rose once more and then didn't. His wings half-formed behind his shoulders froze mid-fold, his knees bent in grief, locked in place. His face, still beautiful, still kind, was caught between love and pain, his eyes open but unseeing. And then silence. A quiet deeper than any battlefield, deeper than the moments before the charge. This was not the silence of peace, but of loss, of something sacred shattered. Leonthi knelt there, forehead pressed to his now cold hand. A hand that once cradled stars, now nothing more than stone. Her tears slid down the side of his marble fingers and fell to the earth, one after another, slow and steady as a funeral march. The grove dimmed. Even the moon, so often bright and watchful, seemed to draw back behind a veil of cloud. No lightning came. No god appeared because the punishment was done. Zeus had spoken. The swan had flown for the last time. And Apollo, god of light, was now a statue of silence, forever frozen in the moment of his final truth. Leonthi stayed long after the transformation finished, arms wrapped around what remained. She did not scream. She did not curse the heavens. There were no Spartans to hear her cries, no warriors to bear witness, only the wind, only the trees, and the stone figure of a god who had once loved her, not with thunder and fire, but with stillness. And now with silence, Leonthi never returned to Sparta. She left her armor where it lay beside the altar, removed her sword, let her war-bound name drift away like smoke over the lake. The woman who had once stood tall among kings now knelt in silence beside a statue that would never move again. The grove became her world. Each full moon she returned, never missing a single one. She brought no offerings, no incense, no prayers, just herself and a memory. She would sit beside the statue of Apollo, fingers brushing the cold stone hand she once held in flesh. Sometimes she spoke. Sometimes she hummed a song he'd never heard, but somehow felt like it belonged to both of them. Other times she simply watched the water and said nothing. The villagers began to whisper. They said a woman haunted the hills, that she wandered under moonlight with eyes like distant stars. Some said she had gone mad. Others said she had been chosen. But no one dared disturb her. Years passed. Winters came and went. Empires shifted. Gods fell silent. But Leonthi remained. She grew older but never frail. Her strength endured, less like a soldier, more like the roots of an olive tree clinging to the same patch of earth year after year, storm after storm. And still the statue stood. Apollo mid-kneel, wings half-formed behind him, gaze fixed on the space where Leonthi always sat, a moment frozen in marble, untouched by time. Some travelers claimed the stone was warm to the touch, that if you placed your hand against his chest, you could feel something faint, like a heartbeat from a dream. And then, one final full moon, Leonthi came. She sat beside him longer than usual, laid her head gently on his shoulder, and never moved again. When the villagers came weeks later, they found her there, peaceful, eyes closed, lips curled faintly in a smile. Beside her, Apollo's statue shimmered faintly if lit from within. No one touched it. They built no shrine, no temple. But the legend grew, and now when the moon is full and the wind is still, some say the swan returns to the lake, not to be seen, but to remember. The forgotten son of Hephaestus, a demigod born not of Olympus, but of fire and steel, deep in the forge of a mortal blacksmith. His task? Steal the eternal flame from Mount Olympus itself to reignite the dying hearths of humanity. But what stood in his way was no simple quest. A three-headed guardian of the underworld, a jealous god in winged sandals, and a storm-summoning oracle who foresaw only one ending, Arian's death. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy the kind of content that merges myth and mystery. And hey, let us know where you're watching from. What time is it for you right now? Sometimes our stories are better than sleep, and other times they just make you dream louder. It's time now to dim the lights. Turn on a fan for some noise. And let's cover what we have for tonight together. In the flickering forge of Myini, where men shaped iron with sweat and prayer, there lived a woman whose hands rivaled the gods. Her name was Callista, a mortal blacksmith with fire in her soul and a hammer that sang when it struck bronze. She built swords that could split spears in midair and armor so seamless it was whispered that Ares himself once wore her breastplates into battle. The gods noticed, but only one descended. Hephaestus, the lame god of the forge, the outcast of Olympus, watched her in silence. He was not drawn by beauty. Callista was not a woman of perfumes or palace gowns. She wore soot like war paint and smelled of iron and pine smoke. But when she worked, Hephaestus saw something divine in her movements, something familiar. One night, as the moon hung low and red over the Aegean, Hephaestus entered her workshop, cloaked in smoke and shadow. He offered no gifts, no divine decree, only his presence. The forge flared brighter that night, and 9 months later a child was born, Arian. He did not cry. Not at first. His eyes opened and glowed like coals, and the fire in the forge leapt as if recognizing its kin. The midwives gasped. One whispered, "He's touched by the divine." Another crossed herself, and the oldest among them muttered, "He's not meant to stay here long." Arian grew faster than other boys. At 5, he could shape iron. At 7, he forged his first blade, flawless, sharp, and oddly warm to the touch. He never played. He never lied. There was a stillness in him that made others uneasy. The village feared what they did not understand. They called him cursed, the son of a god who had no throne. Children avoided him. Priests refused to bless him. But Callista loved him fiercely, teaching him not just to work with fire, but to respect it. "Flame obeys those who listen," she'd say, "not those who command." By the time he turned 16, Aryan's forge burned day and night, shaping weapons for cities he'd never seen and kings he'd never meet. But even as metal flowed beneath his hands, something deeper stirred within him. He wasn't made to serve. He was made to change the world. Long ago, the eternal flame had been a gift stolen from the heavens, defied into existence by Prometheus himself. It was fire, not just for warmth, but for thought, art, creation. It was what set man apart from beast. But that age of defiance had dimmed. Humanity no longer remembered the debt it owed the gods, and the gods, in turn, had turned their backs on mankind. It began slowly. Hearths that once glowed without fail began to flicker out. Forests grew colder, storms stretched longer, crops wilted in spring, and homes were filled with the breath of frost, even in high summer. Children shivered beside unlit chimneys. Old women murmured prayers into ashes that gave no heat. Priests spoke of punishment. Scholars blamed the stars, but across villages, towns, and empires, a different fear took root. Not that the world was ending, but that the gods had abandoned them. And they were right. High atop Mount Olympus, the gods had sealed away the last true flame, a spark kept alive only in the divine brazier, untouched by mortal hand for centuries. No god dared share it again. They feared man's rebellion, feared what Prometheus had begun. They told themselves, let them suffer. They must remember their place. But not all gods agreed. In hidden corners of the world, whispers stirred. Dryads spoke of a boy born of flame. Nymphs saw sparks dancing in a boy's eyes from Myene. The winds carried a name, Arion. In the cold chambers of Delphi, the oracle dreamed of fire walking on two legs, lighting cities with its footsteps. And in the depths of forgotten temples, dying candles sputtered back to life at the sound of a blacksmith's hammer striking anvil. Arion had no idea. He only knew the iron was growing harder to shape, that the flames in his forge required more breath, that the warmth that once came easily was slipping away. But the world had begun to watch. Gods, both old and silent, had turned their gaze to Myene. The divine brazier atop Olympus, though shielded in marble and guarded by fate, flickered for the first time in an age, responding not to a god, but to a boy born of fire and sorrow. And deep within him, something began to glow. Delphi was dying. Once the center of divine council, where kings and warriors climbed stone paths to seek Apollo's voice, now it stood quiet. Its columns cracked and overgrown, its sacred springs reduced to mist. But one voice still lingered, buried deep within the mountain's breath. When Arion arrived in silence, no one greeted him at the gates. The torches lining the temple had long since gone out. Ivy clung to broken altars like fingers, unwilling to let go of lost faith. Thunder growled in the clouds above, not of rain, but of something older, watching. He descended into the hollow chamber where generations before him had once wept and begged. There, seated atop a crumbling stone throne, was the oracle. She was draped in violet robes, skin pale like ash, eyes blind but blazing with storms. Before he could speak, she inhaled sharply like a flame being pulled back into a lantern. "Arion," she hissed, though no name had been spoken. He said nothing. "You will climb the mountain, you will take the flame, and you will die." Her voice cracked like a whip through the stillness. He didn't flinch. He had heard stories of oracles, their riddles wrapped in poetry and metaphor. But this wasn't a prophecy. It was a sentence. She rose slowly, limbs moving like smoke caught in wind. "The gods will oppose you. The world will demand your failure. The flame you seek, it does not belong to mortals. It was stolen once, and the price was eternity in chains." Arion stepped forward, fists clenched. "So let me pay the price." A long silence followed, then laughter, not cruel but tired, the sound of someone who had seen too many stories end the same way. "You already are," she whispered. The room grew dark. The thunder outside crescendoed, the air pulsed with something old, something primal. Then, just as suddenly, everything went still. The oracle slumped back into her seat. Her mouth opened, but only smoke escaped. Her prophecy was done. And though Aryan left without another word, her vision followed him. In dreams, in flame, in every shadow cast by his forge, the gods had spoken. His path was set. But not even Olympus could predict what a dying world would do when handed back its fire. Before one could ascend Olympus, one had to earn the mountain's recognition, and Olympus never bowed to the untested. Legends whispered that the base of the mountain was not stone or snow, but soul, that beneath its foundation was a gate sealed by silence and guarded by the oldest fear in creation, Cerberus, the hound of Hades. No one could pass that gate without first touching death. Aryan did not question it. He had studied myths the way blacksmiths study heat, closely, warily. He knew what waited beneath the roots of Olympus, but to reach the eternal flame, he would have to descend, not metaphorically, but into the very underworld itself. So he prepared not with armor, but with craft. He spent 3 days and 3 nights forging a collar, not for battle, but for submission. It was made of obsidian, iron, and the final ember from his mother's forge. Into it, he carved 3 names, one for each of Cerberus's heads. He whispered them aloud as he worked: memory, loyalty, grief. On the 4th day, he stood before the shadowed mouth of a cave said to lead downward forever. The wind here was cold, but it did not sting the skin. It scraped the soul, and the air smelled not of rot, but of forgotten prayers. He entered deeper and deeper. He walked past bones that glowed faintly in the dark, past torches that lit themselves without flame until he heard it. The breathing, slow, massive, layered, like 3 storms dreaming in unison, Cerberus. He stepped into the clearing and found the beast sleeping on a bed of ash and bone, each head twitching in a different rhythm. Its fur was blacker than absence. Its eyes were closed, but its ears twitched. Aryan did not draw a weapon. He approached, knelt, and held out the collar. Then softly he began to hum. It was the song his mother had sung to him as a child, the one she sang when night made the world feel too big, too cruel. The middle head stirred. The left opened one amber eye. The right snarled, then stopped. They listened, and in that silence, Aryan slipped the collar on. Cerberus exhaled, and the door behind him opened, not with rage, but with respect. Aryan had touched death, and death had stepped aside. The road up Olympus was no road at all. There were no markers, no stars to guide the way, only sheer rock, biting wind, and whispers that echoed from nowhere. Aryan climbed not with certainty, but with instinct. His mortal hands bled, his divine blood burned. The mountain resisted him at every turn. And then he appeared, not with a roar, not in a flash of power, but in silence. Hermes, the trickster, the messenger, the thief. He stood on a ledge ahead, dressed like a traveler, cloak loose, sandals laced with feathers, eyes sharp as broken glass. A crooked grin danced across his lips. "Well," he said, spinning a coin between his fingers, "I thought you'd be taller." Aryan didn't stop climbing. "I know why you're here," Hermes continued, walking casually beside him without ever lifting a foot. "You want to bring fire back to the mortals? Sweet, noble, stupid." Aryan paused. "Then stop me." Hermes chuckled. "Stop you? Oh, no, I'm not here to fight you. I'm here to make sure you understand the deal. So you're walking into the heart of Olympus, into the gods' vault, into a story that isn't yours to tell." "And yet," Aryan replied, "here I am." That smile faded slightly. "You're trying to restore a balance that was broken for a reason," Hermes said. "The flame was a gift once, a mistake, and now the gods guard it like a dragon guards gold. Not because it's precious, but because it's dangerous." Aryan stared at him. Then they've forgotten what danger looks like. For the first time, Hermes' expression soured. The air around them shifted. The coin in his hand vanished. His wings twitched. "You think you're Prometheus," he said, voice cold, "but you're not even a flicker compared to him." "I'm not trying to be him," Aryan answered. "I'm trying to finish what he started." Hermes stepped forward, pressed 2 fingers to Aryan's chest. "Then here's my gift." Pain surged. It wasn't physical, it was deeper. A thread inside him twisted, turned. "The fire you seek," Hermes whispered, "will burn everything you are." Then he vanished. The mountain groaned, thunder rolled. A storm had begun, not of rain, but of consequence. And Arion climbed higher, cursed but unshaken. The curse settled into Arion's chest like frost in the lungs. At first it was subtle, a tightening when he breathed, a dull heat beneath his skin. But the higher he climbed, the more it bit into him, not like a wound, more like erosion. Piece by piece, the man was being scraped away, leaving something raw behind. Mount Olympus was no longer just a mountain. It was alive. Its cliffs shifted beneath his feet. Wind screamed down ravines like ancient voices, furious to be disturbed. The higher he rose, the less mortal the world became. Trees stopped growing, birds stopped singing, even the stars above seemed to pull back. There were no paths, only jagged ledges and sheer faces that demanded sacrifice with each step. Arion bled. He slipped. Once he nearly fell to his death, but a sudden flash of heat from within his chest steadied him. It was as if the flame Hermes spoke of, the one that would burn him, had begun to awaken. But he kept climbing because every time he faltered, he thought of the dying hearths, the cold villages, the children huddled in darkness. He thought of his mother, hands blistered, still forging warmth for a world forgetting what warmth meant. And still, Olympus offered no mercy. Storm clouds gathered above. Lightning danced along the ridge like gods pacing in frustration. He could feel their eyes now, watching, judging, waiting for him to fall. But it wasn't just the mountain fighting him. It was Olympus itself. He passed ancient ruins carved into the stone, temples long abandoned by faith, their altars cracked, their gods forgotten, statues of Athena with eyes chipped out, columns of Zeus split by time and silence. Arion realized something no one else had dared to say aloud. The gods weren't powerful anymore. They were afraid. Afraid that a mortal might bring the fire back without their permission. That someone not born in their halls might carry the light that once defined Olympus. And in that fear they threw their worst at him. Ice, thunder, visions, voices. But he climbed. With hands torn and heart smoldering, he rose above the clouds, and in the distance, lit not by the sun but by divine flame, he saw it. The brazier burning, waiting. It was not what he expected. The summit of Olympus wasn't carved in marble or guarded by gods clad in gold. There were no trumpets, no gates, no thunderclaps of divine welcome. There was only silence and the flame. It stood in the center of a windless clearing on a pedestal of blackened stone. The brazier looked ancient, older than language itself, shaped by hands no longer remembered. And inside it danced the eternal flame, not red, not orange, but white, pure, blinding, alive. It did not flicker, it watched. Arion stepped closer. The heat didn't sear him. It entered him as if recognizing something long lost. His breath caught, his skin prickled. That ember Hermes had cursed into his heart now pulsed like a second heartbeat, calling to the flame like a lost sibling. He reached out. In that moment, time faltered. He saw cities built from firelight. He saw his mother's forge blazing in the dead of winter. He saw civilizations rising and falling, each one built around fire and each one forgetting why it burned. He also saw the punishment, Prometheus, chained to stone, his liver eaten daily by a vulture. The gods had called it justice, but Arion saw it for what it was, fear wearing a crown. He could turn back. He could let humanity adapt to the cold, forget fire, forget him. But then he heard the wind whisper her name, Callista, and he remembered who he was. He grabbed the flame, and it took him. Pain screamed through his body, not like burning, like being rewritten. Bones cracked and reformed, his skin glowed, veins pulsing with light. He fell to his knees, roaring soundlessly as the flame poured into every part of him, erasing the boy, forging the fire bearer. He wasn't holding it anymore. He was it. The brazier flickered, then dimmed, then went cold. Because the eternal flame was no longer chained to Olympus, it had chosen a new vessel. Arion collapsed beside the empty pedestal. Smoke rose from his fingertips, but his eyes glowed like dawn. He breathed barely, but with each breath, a wisp of warmth spread outward into the wind, down the mountain, toward the world below. He had taken the fire, but not for himself, for everyone. Arion did not walk down Olympus. He carried it with him. The moment the flame entered him, the mountains stopped resisting. Winds fell silent, the sky cleared. Even the stone beneath his feet seemed to shift and guide him, not with reverence, but with recognition. He was no longer a trespasser. He was a torch. His body smoldered with divine heat, not the kind that scorched wall, but the kind that stirred life. Wherever his foot touched earth, frost melted. With every breath, the cursed wind softened. The air smelled not of smoke, but of renewal, of rebirth. But he was not whole. His limbs trembled beneath the weight of what he carried. The eternal flame was not just fire, it was memory. He could feel every spark it had ever ignited. The first campfire in a prehistoric cave, the torch that lit Athens, the forge that built Troy, and he felt the cost of all of it. He saw the cities burned in its name, the temples razed, the wars fought with stolen fire and ambition. The gift of the gods had never been innocent. But this time he would not give it as a weapon. He descended through cloud and silence, past broken statues of gods who had once been worshipped, now crumbling in divine decay. He passed the cave where Cerberus had once guarded the gate, but the beast was gone. As if even death had stepped aside for what Arion had become, he reached the world below. And there, in a frozen village where hearths had long turned to ash, people gathered around him, not in fear, but in awe. He did not speak. He simply held out his hand, and a flame danced from his fingertips into the nearest hearth. It roared to life, then another and another. A chorus of warmth spread from home to home, city to city, across lands that had forgotten what it felt like to gather around a fire without praying first. Arion burned. His hair shimmered like molten gold. His skin cracked like cooled obsidian. He was dying, but not fading. He was becoming something else. He had not stolen the flame, he had become it. And everywhere it burned, the world whispered his name, not in worship, but in gratitude. No tomb was ever built for Arion. No statue was carved. No songs were sung in temples. There was no procession, no mourning, no final battle to mark his passing. And yet he never disappeared. After the fires returned, strange things began to happen across the land. In distant villages where no traveler had passed, hearths lit on their own. Entire forests, once frozen solid, blossomed overnight. Blacksmiths claimed their forges heated faster. Children, huddled in the cold, told their parents they saw a man of light standing beside the flame before it rose. No one could prove anything, but they all told the same story. He walked until there was nothing left of him to walk with. His body had long since cracked and burned, not from weakness, but from transformation. What remained of Arion, bone, blood, voice, had become spark, smoke, heat, and he gave it all away. His mother's forge was the last place touched, old, abandoned, its fires cold for decades, until one night a traveler passing through claimed he saw a boy hammering something glowing white at the anvil. When he looked again, the forge was empty, but the flame danced high and hot just like it used to. They say the gods felt it. That Olympus, sensing it had been stripped of its power, trembled in its silence. But the gods did not strike back. They did not rage, because even they understood Arion had not challenged them with war or pride. He had reminded them of purpose. And so the eternal flame, once hoarded by immortals, now flickered in every village, every city, every lonely mountain hut. It lived in the warmth of soup shared by strangers, in candles placed by grieving hands, in torches lifted by rebels seeking light in the darkest places. And always, always, they whispered the same name, Arion. Some say when your fire dims for no reason, it's him passing through. Others say if you listen closely to the crackle of the flame, you'll hear the rhythm of a hammer striking an anvil. Steady, patient, eternal. Because Arion never died. He became warmth itself, Not a god, not a hero, just a boy who gave up everything to help the world remember how to glow again. Melanion was not born under a palace roof or amidst temple incense. He came into the world beneath a willow tree during a storm that split the sky in two. His mother, a midwife's daughter, swaddled him in a linen wrap as thunder rolled over the hills. Birds scattered, the rain danced, and the child did not cry. He hummed from the moment he could walk. Music followed him. Streams whispered melodies when he knelt to drink. Leaves trembled in harmony as he passed. He didn't need instruction. Sound belonged to him. By 10, he could mimic any bird call and weave it into song. By 16, he played the lyre with such grace that even hardened warriors paused to listen. He sang of rivers, of lost brothers, of fields before war, songs that filled men's eyes with tears they didn't know they had. People called him a gift, a miracle, a child of divine breath. He never claimed it. Melanion traveled from village to village, sharing his music without coin or pride. His voice calmed fevers. His chords softened hardened hearts. He once played for a dying child who, upon hearing his lullaby, smiled and drifted into death as if it were a dream. But not all ears that listened were mortal. One spring evening, as he sat beside a glimmering river and strummed a tune about starlight, the very air around him changed. The wind slowed, the water stilled, even the frogs silenced their song. And then they arrived, the Muses. 9 of them, stepping lightly from behind the veil of the world, cloaked in light and sound, each carried her own essence: history, tragedy, dance, epic poetry, and more. Their eyes were not kind, not cruel, just knowing. They listened, and then to Melanion's astonishment, they sang back. 9 voices in perfect harmony, older than language. Melanion closed his eyes and without thought joined them. His voice didn't echo theirs. It evolved them. When the last note fell into silence, even the stars seemed closer. One of the Muses, Calliope, eldest and most stern, touched his brow. "You are not ordinary," she said. "You are a vessel." And thus began the legend of Melanion, the bard whose voice would shake the heavens. From that night on, Melanion was no longer just a gifted mortal. He was touched, marked, whispered about. The Muses had chosen him. In the quiet folds of Mount Helicon, where few dared to tread, they invited him into their sacred circle. There, beneath ancient trees and skies unclouded by mortal ambition, Melanion learned not through lectures, but through experience. Calliope, muse of epic, taught him how to bend a story into sound. Clio whispered the histories of nations into his ears as he slept. Terpsichore danced barefoot through leaves while he played beside her, his fingers learning the rhythm of wind and body. Euterpe laid her flute across his palm and said only, "Listen." And he did. He absorbed not just melodies, but truths, the kind that lived between words, the kind that mortals rarely noticed but felt. In the hush before a storm, in the ache of longing, in the gasp of a child at first snowfall, the Muses gave him not power but perspective, and they asked for only one thing in return: sing for them. Them, meaning mortals, the lost, the weary, the proud, and the broken. Those who needed to remember that beauty still existed even in suffering. That song could be both balm and blade. At first, Melanion obeyed. He performed in city forums and quiet fields, played before kings and beggars alike. His songs stitched broken hearts, stirred revolutions, mended fathers to daughters and enemies to uneasy peace. But as his gift grew, so did something else: ambition. He began chasing sounds the Muses hadn't taught, notes no god had touched. In the stillest parts of the night, he would write alone, drafting fragments of something beyond language. A song that could bend time, still the wind, and bring tears to stone. A final song. He told no one, not even the Muses, because some part of him no longer wanted to share the divine. He wanted to surpass it. And the Muses, ever watchful, saw the change. Not in his fingers, but in his eyes, the way he looked beyond them, as if destiny owed him more than admiration. And in the distance, fate stirred slightly. Because no mortal walks beside the divine forever without cost, Melanion withdrew from the world. He left behind the applause, the requests, the gifts from kings, and the adoration of cities. He stopped performing in public, stopped teaching students, even stopped speaking to the muses. Some claimed he had fallen ill. Others said he had died. But in truth, he had gone to the shadowed slopes of Mount Helicon, deeper than any mortal had ever gone, where only echoes of the old gods stirred. There, in a cave lined with crystals that sang when touched by light, he began composing the final song. It came to him in pieces, sometimes in sleep, sometimes in thunder, sometimes in silence so deep it frightened him. He didn't write it. He found it like a secret hidden between the folds of reality. The melody refused to stay still. It changed when he breathed, twisted with his heartbeat. It was not a song for performance. It was truth in sound. He heard the birth of stars in its opening note. He felt the deaths of empires in its fall. It was not sad. It was not joyful. It simply was. He labored for months, maybe years. Time bent strangely inside the cave. He ate little, slept only when the music allowed it. He would weep one moment, laugh the next, as though the song played through his soul instead of his hands. And when it was finished, the world changed. Birds stopped mid-flight. Trees leaned toward the windless mountain. Streams went quiet. The sky itself held its breath. And far above, in the marble chambers of Olympus, the gods turned their heads. Even the fates, who never looked away from their weaving, paused. Clotho whispered, "A thread trembles." Lachesis frowned, and Atropos, whose shears never hesitated, set them down. They listened. The song did not demand worship. It did not beg to be loved. It simply revealed everything. When the final note faded, even the cave refused to echo it, as if the world knew to repeat it would be a crime. The gods waited. The muses waited. They expected Melanion to return to offer this wonder to the world, but he didn't. He hid it. And in doing so, he set a different music in motion, one of silence and consequences. When Melanion emerged from the cave, the world felt smaller. The skies, once so vast, seemed pale beside the echoes of the song still humming in his bones. People rushed to greet him, musicians, poets, even priests. They begged to hear what he had written, to feel whatever power had moved the heavens. But Melanion said nothing. They asked again. He smiled faintly. Not yet. Only the muses saw the shift. They came to him one dusk, stepping from starlight like breath from a lyre. Their robes glowed with inspiration, but their eyes held warning. "You were chosen to carry beauty," said Erato, soft and sorrowful. "But beauty is not meant to be buried," added Cleo. "You must sing it," whispered Calliope. Melanion bowed his head. "I will not see it cheapened." They flinched as if he'd struck them. "You think mortals unworthy?" Terpsichore asked, voice trembling. "You think you alone are its guardian?" He met their eyes, not with rage, but with something colder. Possession. "Yes." Silence felt like winter between them. "Then you are no longer ours," said Calliope. "Not because you created something beyond us, but because you hoard it." He said nothing, and they vanished. Still, the gods waited. Even Zeus, who rarely concerned himself with mortal affairs, paused his thunder to listen. Even Hades tilted his head in the depths. They waited for a single note, a whisper, a fragment. Nothing came. Melanion kept the song locked inside himself, not written, not recorded, not shared. He called it sacred, but sacred things, when sealed too long, begin to sour. He performed other pieces. They were still beautiful. Audiences wept. Crowds cheered. But he knew, and so did the divine. Something was missing, and worse, something had been stolen. The song that could stir the fates, bend time, and touch the gods themselves was buried beneath his pride. He told himself he protected it. But the muses, watching from afar, saw the truth. He had chained the divine to his ego, and the gods who endure madness, war, and worship without blinking do not abide theft. And so one night the wind turned still, the stars went quiet, and a curse began to bloom. Not with fire, but with memory. The curse came softly. No thunder, no divine wrath from Olympus, just a dream. Melanian lay beneath an open sky, cradled in the same silence he had once treasured. Sleep pulled him gently into darkness, and there, waiting, was the song, the final song. It returned, clearer, richer, impossibly perfect. He heard notes he'd never written, harmonies he hadn't yet imagined. It lifted him through stars, wove him into oceans, unspooled the very fabric of meaning. He wept in joy, in awe, in surrender. And then, morning, gone, not faded, erased. No memory, not a note, not a name. The melody he'd written with his soul, felt in his bones, was gone like mist at sunrise. At first he thought it a cruel trick of sleep. He grabbed his lyre and tried to recall even a single progression. Nothing. He strummed wildly, off-key, frantic. Nothing. That night, he returned to his bed early, heart pounding, and the song returned, more radiant than ever. He sang along in the dream, tears streaming, fingers dancing through light. It felt real. He could remember it within the dream. But once again, with dawn's first breath, gone. Melanian began keeping candles lit through the night, scribbling notes in the dark. He begged his mind to retain a phrase, a rhythm, a single image. But no matter what he tried, it vanished again and again and again. He stopped playing, refused to perform. Crowds dwindled, friends left. His home grew dusty and cold, but none of it mattered. He had one obsession now. Remember the song. The muses stood at a distance, watching with sorrow. He was given a gift, said Euterpe, and he chose to cage it. Now he is the only one who will hear it, said Polyhymnia. And never remember, whispered Cleo. It was not vengeance, it was balance. Melanian would hear the song every night for eternity, but it would live only in dreams. Each sunrise, it would slip through his grasp like water through cracked hands. He would never stop chasing it, never stop hoping. And in time, hope would rot into madness, because what torments a bard more than forgetting the greatest song he ever knew, and knowing it still sings without him. Melanian stopped counting the nights. They bled into each other, an endless loop of ecstasy and loss. Each evening, he slipped into dreams where the final song embraced him like a lover returned from war, and each dawn he woke alone, screaming, weeping, blank. At first, he tried to outwit the curse. He hired scribes to sleep beside him, begged seers to extract fragments from his mind. He sang to mirrors, hoping his own voice would betray some hidden memory. Nothing worked, and slowly he began to fray. He stopped eating. His robes hung from a body gone hollow. His fingers trembled when he reached for his lyre, the same instrument he once cradled like a child. Strings snapped under his shaking hands. He didn't fix them. He didn't need them anymore. Because in sleep, the music still came. It became his only purpose, the only place he felt whole. And waking became a punishment. He cursed the sun, smashed his windows, sealed himself in a room with no light, but still the song left with the morning. When he emerged, he no longer resembled a bard. He was wild-eyed, gaunt, his once golden voice now hoarse from nights of desperate humming. He wandered from village to village like a beggar, not for coin, but for memory. "Have you heard it?" he'd ask strangers. "The song with no beginning and no end. Have you heard it in your sleep?" People pitied him at first, then feared him. Some threw stones, others fled. He began to sing fragments in the streets, random, frantic bursts of melody. They made no sense to others, but to him they were clues, keys, pieces of a shattered mirror he could almost reassemble, but every time it slipped through his fingers. He laughed when he failed, then cried, then laughed again. And every night the song came back, shimmering, whole, just out of reach. The muses watched, not with anger, but with mourning. He had once been their finest vessel. Now he was a cracked jar, overflowing only when no one could hear. And in that descent, the song he'd hoarded became the thing that unraveled him. Not with fire, not with wrath, but with silence. Melanian no longer lived in the world. His body walked through it, yes, but his mind was elsewhere, caught between dreams and daylight, past and present. A song only he could hear, and only when it was too late to hold. He wandered barefoot through cities that once hosted him like royalty. Children who once sat at his feet now ran from his shadow. His name, once sung in praise, became a warning. Don't end up like Melanian. He slept where he could, under trees and empty chapels, sometimes in the doorways of inns whose keepers once begged for his presence. He no longer asked for food, only a place to rest, only the dream. The curse never failed. Each night he fell asleep with trembling hope, and the final song returned, whole, alive, a perfect ghost. And each morning he woke to forgetting. The cruelty wasn't in the silence, it was in the memory of sound. He remembered that he had heard something transcendent, that it had meant everything, but he could no longer remember why. He began speaking to shadows, to trees, to the stars. Sometimes he would sing to strangers and demand they sing back, convinced the melody was hiding in someone else's throat. Once he believed a child had hummed it in passing. He followed the family across 2 villages before collapsing in the dust, begging the boy to sing again. But the sound had been something else, something ordinary. He wept for hours, and still, each night, the song returned, taunting, embracing, divine. He tried to hum it as he dreamed, tried to wake mid-melody, but the curse was clever. He could not move within the dream. He could not record it, write it, carry it, only hear it. And when he woke, emptiness. Some who saw him said he still hummed in his sleep, that if you placed your ear near his mouth at midnight, you could hear music unlike any other. But only then, only in darkness. The muses no longer came. The gods stopped watching, and Melanian, once the voice of the world, now wandered like an echo of a song the world could no longer remember, and he could no longer forget. Melanian had grown thin as twilight. His skin, once kissed by golden light, was now pale and paper-thin. His voice, what remained of it, was hoarse from years of whispers and wandering. He no longer searched for food, shelter, or even the song. He simply walked. One evening, he reached a cliff overlooking the sea. It was quiet there. No towns, no roads, no curious eyes, just the wind, the waves, and the stars slowly rising in the deepening blue. He sat curled against a stone, the sea breeze tangling what remained of his hair. He didn't weep. He didn't sing. He simply closed his eyes, and the dream came again. But this time something was different. There was no delay, no mist to wade through, no struggle to hear. The final song was there from the beginning, full and clear. But it was not just sound. It was a place, a presence, a world built from music. Melanian stood within it, barefoot on chords that bent like grass, stars pulsing above in rhythm. The sky was a symphony. The wind sang in harmony, and he was not just hearing it, he was part of it. His own voice joined the song, and it did not tremble, it did not forget, it soared. He saw every note he had lost, every phrase he'd mourned, but now he understood. The song had never left him, it had grown without him, it had become more than his hands could hold. He was not its owner, he was its witness. And in that final dream there was no sorrow, no shame, no punishment, only release. When the sun rose, Melanian did not stir. The wind lifted softly around his body as if carrying away a final breath. A shepherd passing the cliffs found him later, peaceful, hands resting on his chest as if cradling an invisible lyre. There was no scroll, no recording, but above him, high in the coastal sky, seabirds flew in strange formations, almost like they danced to something only they could hear. And the sea, for a moment, sang, not in words, not in melody, but in something older than either, something he had finally become. Melanian was buried beneath a lone olive tree near the cliff where he last slept. No priest performed the rites, no crowds gathered, just the shepherd who found him and a few villagers who remembered the stories, faint echoes of the bard who once made the gods pause mid-breath. There was no monument, only silence. But silence has a way of amplifying truth. In the years that followed, strange things were whispered across the land. Travelers claimed that if you passed that cliff under a new moon, you might hear a melody in the wind, brief, fleeting, heartbreakingly beautiful. Not a full song, just a note, just enough to make you stop. Children began dreaming of music they'd never heard. Musicians would wake in the night with tears on their cheeks and no memory of why. And sometimes when a bard sat alone at dusk with no audience, a sudden chord would form beneath their fingers. Something not theirs, something perfect. They never remembered it by morning. The muses said nothing. They did not curse another bard. They did not reclaim the song because they understood what Melanion had become. Not a warning, not a hero, but a vessel turned legend. A soul whose punishment was born not of cruelty, but of refusal, and whose redemption came not through sharing, but surrender. The final song was never written down. It was never performed in amphitheaters or temples. It does not exist in scroll or scripture, but it lives in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, in the hush before a performer strums their first chord, in the way the sea sounds different when you're grieving. Melanion's song became part of the world itself, not to be remembered, but to be felt. A whisper in the bones, a melody without words. And those who feel it even for a moment never forget the silence that follows. They say if you stand alone on the right cliff on the right night with no one watching and the wind is kind, you might hear a sound that doesn't belong to this world, just a fragment, just a breath. And maybe if you listen closely enough, you'll finally understand why Melanion never let it go. The birth of jazz didn't happen overnight, and it didn't come from fame, luxury, or polished music schools. It came from something much deeper: pain, resilience, and joy found in the cracks of hardship. Jazz was born out of real life, and real life, especially for the Black communities in the American South, was marked by both suffering and spirit. After centuries of slavery, even freedom came with struggle. Racism, poverty, and exclusion defined the world outside. But inside churches, homes, and neighborhoods, people built something else. They built community. They built music. Songs became ways to remember, to mourn, to pray, and to celebrate. Drums carried memory. Voices carried history. Every rhythm was layered with something sacred and human. This is where jazz found its roots. Not in a single song or solo, but in the way sorrow was carried with grace and turned into rhythm. It wasn't written down. It wasn't created for stages or critics. It happened in backyards, on street corners, and in late-night gatherings where gospel met blues, where African rhythms collided with European harmonies, where people told their stories not with words but with sound. In New Orleans, the city where jazz would take its first breath, life was alive with music. Births, weddings, parades, even funerals had music at their center. A funeral might begin with slow, somber hymns only to erupt into joyful brass music once the body had been laid to rest. It was a way of honoring both the sorrow of goodbye and the beauty of a life well lived. This balance between heartbreak and celebration became the heartbeat of jazz itself. In those early days, the music had no name. People just played. They mixed styles, they improvised, they followed feeling more than form, and slowly a new sound began to take shape. One that couldn't be boxed in, one that bent the rules, invited mistakes, and welcomed freedom. That sound was jazz. It didn't erase sorrow, it danced with it. It didn't deny hardship, it transformed it. And in that transformation, something extraordinary was born. Jazz came from pain, but it carried joy, it carried life, and it carried the proof that even in the darkest places, something beautiful can rise. At the turn of the 20th century, New Orleans was unlike any other city in America. It wasn't just a port city. It was a meeting place, a crossroads, a living, breathing blend of culture, language, history, and sound. This was where jazz would be born because no other place had the ingredients quite like this. The city was French, Spanish, African, Creole, Caribbean, Catholic, Protestant, enslaved, free, and everything in between. Each group brought its own traditions, music, instruments, and stories. And instead of remaining separate, these cultures collided every single day. In the French Quarter, you might hear operas or chamber music drifting from elegant salons. In Congo Square on Sundays, you'd find African rhythms in full force, drums, dances, and chants passed down for generations. Just a few streets away, gospel choirs filled churches while marching bands practiced for parades. Street performers played ragtime on battered pianos. Children learned hymns by ear. Brass bands marched through the neighborhoods, their sounds spilling into every alley. Music was everywhere, and more importantly, it was shared. New Orleans was one of the few cities where people of different races and classes regularly heard one another's music. Musicians learned from each other, borrowing rhythms, phrases, and techniques. An old spiritual might inspire a new melody. A brass line from a parade could end up in a blues improvisation. There were no boundaries, just inspiration. The city's geography played a role too. Tight-knit neighborhoods meant that sound traveled easily. The call of a cornet or the beat of a drum could reach from one block to the next, drawing people in. A single porch performance could become a jam session by nightfall. This collision of cultures didn't happen peacefully. Segregation and racism were very real, but music found its way around those walls. It was the common language in a divided place. And in New Orleans, that language kept evolving. Out of this rich, noisy, soulful melting pot came something entirely new. Not classical, not folk, not blues, but something made from the pieces of all of them. The sound of jazz was forming, improvised, unpredictable, impossible to define, and no one city except New Orleans could have given it life. Long before jazz had a name, it had a heartbeat. That heartbeat came from Africa. For generations, enslaved Africans brought to America carried with them more than just survival. They carried memory, rhythm, and music. Even in the darkest chapters of human history, they held on to the sounds that reminded them of home. And in New Orleans, those sounds endured. The most famous space where these lived was Congo Square, a patch of land just outside the French Quarter. On Sundays, the only day enslaved people were allowed rest, they gathered to dance, play drums, sing, and share traditions. For a few hours, they reclaimed freedom through rhythm. What echoed through Congo Square wasn't just entertainment, it was cultural resistance. The call and response chants, the polyrhythmic drumming, the body movements, all were ties to identity, ancestry, and dignity. The square itself became sacred, pulsing with life in the face of oppression. Over time, those rhythms mixed with European instruments, fiddles, horns, and accordions. The banjo, descended from West African lutes, found its place alongside French melodies and Spanish guitar forms. The result was a sound that couldn't be traced to one source. It was the child of many. African influence also shaped the spirit of the music. In many West African cultures, music wasn't separate from life. It was life. It told stories, marked seasons, healed wounds, and brought communities together. That sense of music as emotion, as communication, found its way into every layer of jazz. From field hollers to work songs, spirituals to blues, the musical language of the African diaspora was alive and evolving. Each note carried weight. Each beat had purpose. And from this emotional depth came the power of improvisation, expressing feeling in the moment, not through perfection, but through honesty. Jazz inherited that language. It didn't follow strict rules because life didn't either. It bent, shifted, responded. It felt. It was never just about technique. It was about truth. The echoes of Africa gave jazz its soul. They gave it rhythm that moved the body and pain that touched the heart. Jazz may have taken shape in America, but its roots dug deep into another continent, and those roots still hum beneath every horn, every drum, and every note played in its name. In the years following the Civil War, New Orleans found itself with something unexpected: leftover instruments. Brass horns, clarinets, drums, and tubas, once used by military bands, were no longer needed. They found their way into pawn shops, attics, and secondhand stores, gathering dust until curious hands brought them back to life. Those hands didn't belong to trained musicians. They belonged to ordinary people: barbers, butchers, shoe shiners, porters, Men and boys who couldn't afford formal lessons but taught themselves by listening, feeling, experimenting. They took those brass instruments and made them speak in ways no one ever had before. The result wasn't polite. It wasn't proper. It was loud, raw, and full of soul. These self-taught musicians weren't reading sheet music. They were inventing their own language, bending notes, sliding between keys, mixing rhythms that weren't supposed to fit together. And in doing so, they made the instruments their own. The cornet became a voice for storytelling. The clarinet wove harmonies like a singer's sigh. The drums held it all together, steady but unpredictable. And the tuba, deep and round, gave the music its powerful heartbeat. Every street in New Orleans became a kind of classroom. Marching bands paraded through neighborhoods. Brass quartets played at fish fries, dances, and funerals. If a child had talent, he could learn just by watching and imitating. You didn't need to be rich. You just needed rhythm. Jazz was forming, not in pristine concert halls, but in motion. It was music you walked with, danced to, lived inside. Improvisation wasn't a trick, it was survival. If you dropped a note, you bent another to catch it. If you didn't know the tune, you made one up that fit. Jazz didn't punish mistakes, it turned them into opportunities. What began with leftover instruments became a revolution. These tools of military order were reborn as instruments of personal expression. They no longer marched to someone else's command. They swung, they swayed, they shouted with joy and pain. In New Orleans, brass wasn't just metal, it was magic. It was transformation, and it would soon become the voice of a whole new music, a music that would spread from those streets to the rest of the world. Charles Buddy Bolden was born in New Orleans in 1877. By the late 1890s, he was already making noise, quite literally. Bolden played the cornet, but not the way others did. His sound was louder, freer, and more emotional than anything the city had heard. They said, when Bolden played, you didn't just listen, you felt it. He wasn't trained in music theory. He couldn't read sheet music, but he didn't need to. Bolden played from instinct. He took bits of ragtime, blues, gospel, and brass band marches and stirred them together into something new. His music didn't fit into a box. It swung, it shouted, it mourned. It had soul. Crowds followed him. Clubs filled when he performed. People would dance until dawn. His band played in dance halls and on street corners, at parades and parties, in rough neighborhoods and across the river. He became known for a song called Funky Butt, one of the first jazz tunes ever played and one that captured the raw, unapologetic energy of his sound. But what made Bolden special wasn't just volume or improvisation. It was how human his playing was. His horn laughed, cried, flirted, and confessed. It spoke when words couldn't. Sadly, Bolden's light burned fast. In 1907, at just 30 years old, he suffered a mental breakdown. He was committed to the Louisiana State Insane Asylum, where he would remain for the rest of his life. He never recorded a single note. No surviving audio exists of his playing. Everything we know comes from stories passed down from musicians, dancers, and fans who remembered how he made them feel. Yet, even without recordings, Bolden's influence echoes in the DNA of jazz. Musicians like Louis Armstrong would later credit him as the father of the sound. The way Bolden bent notes, improvised freely, and played with emotion set the tone for everyone who followed. He was a mystery, a myth, a man who created something immortal with nothing but a cornet, a wild heart, and a rhythm all his own. And though his voice was lost to time, his spirit lives on, in every solo, every swing, and every note played with soul. If Buddy Bolden was the wild flame that lit jazz's first spark, Jelly Roll Morton was the one who gave it shape. Born Ferdinand Joseph Lamoth in New Orleans in 1890, he gave himself the name Jelly Roll and called himself the inventor of jazz. A bold claim, but one rooted in real innovation. Where Bolden brought raw energy, Morton brought refinement. He didn't tame jazz's spirit, but he taught it how to dance in time. Jelly Roll was a pianist, a composer, and a storyteller. By his teenage years, he was playing in brothels, bars, and gambling dens, places where music had to be lively, seductive, and always entertaining. He soaked up every influence New Orleans had to offer: Spanish melodies, ragtime rhythms, Creole folk songs, and African American blues. Then he blended them into his own signature sound. What made Morton different was his ability to write jazz down. He composed intricate arrangements for multiple instruments, turning jam sessions into orchestrated experiences. His famous Red Hot Peppers recordings weren't just performances, they were carefully crafted pieces filled with syncopation, breaks, and unexpected shifts. Still, Jelly Roll never lost the spirit of improvisation. He left space in his compositions for soloists to shine, for riffs to grow, for surprise to sneak in. He believed jazz wasn't just music. It was feeling, style, and attitude. And he wore that belief like a badge, as often dressing in sharp suits and speaking with a showman's flair. In 1926, when he recorded Black Bottom Stomp and Dr. Jazz, the world began to listen. His music traveled far beyond New Orleans, reaching Chicago and New York, helping plant jazz firmly on the national stage. But Jelly Roll's importance goes beyond his compositions. He proved that jazz could be both spontaneous and structured, that it didn't have to choose between freedom and form. And he gave future musicians a blueprint, a way to write, record, and preserve a sound that had been mostly passed down by ear. Some say he exaggerated his role in jazz's birth, but even if he didn't invent it, he shaped it, framed it, and pushed it forward. Jelly Roll Morton gave jazz its first spine, and yet it still danced. If jazz had a heartbeat, it would sound a lot like Louis Armstrong. Born in 1901 in one of New Orleans' roughest neighborhoods, an area known as the Battlefield, Armstrong came into a world of poverty and hardship. His father left early, and his mother often struggled to make ends meet. As a boy, he worked odd jobs to help his family. And one day, after firing a pistol in celebration on New Year's Eve, he was arrested and sent to a home for troubled boys. But that home changed everything. There, Louis was introduced to the cornet, and from the moment he held it, something awakened inside him. Music became his voice, his escape, and soon his identity. He learned quickly, listened deeply, and absorbed everything from the local players around him, especially his idol, King Oliver, one of New Orleans' top band leaders at the time. By the early 1920s, Armstrong had joined Oliver's band in Chicago. His sound was unmistakable, warm, bold, and full of life. Unlike many musicians of the day, Armstrong didn't just blend in with the band. He stood out. His solos sang, they soared. And when he began to sing too with that gravelly, joyful voice, he won hearts instantly. Armstrong brought something to jazz that hadn't been fully realized before: personality. He turned solos into conversations. He made his trumpet laugh, weep, dance, and dream. His recordings with the Hot 5 and Hot 7 bands like West End Blues and Heebie Jeebies weren't just performances, they were moments. Scat singing, which he popularized by accident when he dropped his lyric sheet mid-recording, became a jazz staple. And his smile, wide, sincere, and full of mischief, became a symbol of the joy jazz could bring. Louis Armstrong didn't invent jazz, but he gave it its soul. He turned a regional sound into a global voice. He crossed racial barriers with his music, inspiring audiences of all colors and generations. Where others played notes, Louis told stories. He showed the world that jazz wasn't just music, it was feeling. And no one felt it more deeply or shared it more generously than the man from the battlefield with a trumpet in his hands and the world in his heart. As jazz began to travel north to Chicago, east to New York, and eventually around the world, New Orleans remained its sacred home. While other cities added their own styles and spins, the streets of the Crescent City held on to the original spirit. There, jazz never became just a genre. It stayed something living, breathing, and communal. In New Orleans, jazz wasn't only for nightclubs or concert halls. It was part of everyday life. You could hear it in neighborhood parades, birthday parties, street performances, and most famously in jazz funerals. These were not quiet, solemn affairs. They were emotional journeys, starting with sorrow and ending in celebration. A jazz funeral would begin with a slow, mournful hymn. The band played in minor keys, matching the weight of grief. But once the body was laid to rest, the music would transform. The tempo would rise. The horns would dance. People would clap, spin umbrellas, and form a second line. A group of dancers and followers who turned mourning into movement. That spirit, the ability to honor pain while embracing joy, was at the heart of New Orleans jazz. Even as the music industry evolved and jazz gave way to swing, bebop, and later fusion and modern interpretations, New Orleans held tight to the early traditions. Musicians passed songs down by ear, not just through lessons, but through living the music. Children grew up watching uncles and neighbors play on porches and street corners. Instruments were often shared. Fans were made of cousins, classmates, and old friends. This wasn't nostalgia. It was legacy, a living thread that tied each generation to the next. New Orleans jazz also remained deeply tied to place. You could walk through the French Quarter and still hear the same rhythms that Buddy Bolden might have played over 100 years earlier. Brass bands marched through the same streets. Clubs like Preservation Hall kept the old songs alive, not as museum pieces, but as expressions of the now. In a city shaped by joy and tragedy, floods and festivals, jazz was the music that carried its soul. It had survived wars, poverty, racism, and even natural disasters. Because jazz wasn't just something New Orleans created, it was something it needed, a voice that had never stopped singing. Jazz was never just music. It was a heartbeat, a protest, a prayer. It was laughter at the end of sorrow. It was survival, dressed in rhythm. And though its sound has shifted over time, its spirit, the part born on the streets of New Orleans, has never faded. In the century since its creation, jazz has traveled far. It's been reimagined in smoky New York clubs, echoed through European concert halls, and blended into genres from hip-hop to rock to classical. It became a language spoken across cultures, a symbol of freedom, creativity, and soul. But no matter how far it reached, jazz never forgot where it came from. It never left behind the pain, joy, and improvisation that gave it life. At its best, it still carries that same energy, the spirit that says, "I will make beauty from whatever I'm given." That spirit lived in Buddy Bolden's cornet, blasting across open fields with no recording to prove he was ever there. It lived in Jelly Roll Morton's piano, crafting jazz's first compositions while still leaving room for surprise. It lived in Louis Armstrong's trumpet and voice, breaking barriers and melting hearts with every note. And it lives on today in the parades of New Orleans, in the fingers of young musicians learning old songs, in the second lines that dance through city streets, refusing to let grief walk alone. It lives in the silence before a solo, in the swing of a brushed snare, in the cry of a saxophone that can't be explained. Jazz endures not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. It was born from sorrow and shaped by joy. It grew through struggle and rose through hope. It taught the world that music doesn't need a script, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to feel, to improvise, and to keep going. From the cracked sidewalks of New Orleans came something eternal. From sorrow and rhythm came something beautiful. And though the names may change, the instruments may shift, and the songs may evolve, the soul of jazz plays on, softly, boldly, always. Vincent van Gogh, the Dutch painter whose art, madness, and passion turned him into one of history's most misunderstood geniuses. From starry nights to tragic endings, Van Gogh's story is one of brilliance clashing with pain and beauty born out of suffering. His legacy still stirs hearts, inspires artists, and challenges our ideas of success and failure. Before you get comfortable, as always, take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you enjoy our content. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Sometimes our stories keep you up, other times they put you to sleep. We're working on a few boring ones. Don't worry. Now, dim the lights, turn on a fan for that soothing hum, and let's dive into the world of Vincent van Gogh together. Vincent Willem van Gogh was born on March 30th, 1853, in the small village of Zundert in the southern Netherlands. His birth was quiet, but its timing was haunting. Exactly 1 year before, his parents had given birth to another son, also named Vincent, who was stillborn. They buried that child and gave their next son the same name. Vincent grew up knowing that just outside the local church, a tombstone bore his name and birth date, only a year off. Imagine what that does to a child's mind. He was the eldest of 6 children born to Theodorus van Gogh, a Protestant minister, and Anna Cornelia Carbentus, a woman with a passion for nature and drawing. His family was religious, structured, and modest. From early on, Vincent was different, sensitive, serious, withdrawn. He often wandered alone in the countryside, staring at fields, trees, and skies. Nature even then spoke to him in a way people often didn't. School never quite worked for him. Though intelligent and curious, he struggled to connect with classmates and teachers. He wasn't an easy child, prone to sudden mood swings and long silences. Some described him as intense, even difficult. Others saw him as kind, thoughtful, and deeply feeling. But above all, he seemed to live just slightly apart from the world around him, like a guest in his own life. His younger brother, Theo, would become his closest companion, emotionally and spiritually. Their bond would one day carry Vincent through the darkest moments of his life. But in these early years, Vincent was mostly alone, with his thoughts, his questions, and the landscapes of his imagination. He wasn't painting yet. That would come much later, but the seeds were already there. A fascination with nature, an obsession with beauty in the ordinary, and a loneliness that colored everything. Vincent wasn't the type to demand attention. He lingered on the edges of things, quiet, watchful, collecting details the rest of the world ignored. Even then, it was clear this was no ordinary child, and perhaps deep down, Vincent knew he was walking a path few could understand. A life of color, heartache, and beauty was waiting just ahead. But for now, he was simply a child of silence. As Vincent entered his late teens and early 20s, the world expected him to find direction, a career, a purpose, but Vincent's path refused to straighten. Instead, it twisted, stalled, and doubled back. He tried to fit into the mold society offered, but something inside him always resisted. His uncle, a successful art dealer, helped him land a job at the firm Goupil & Cie. Vincent moved to The Hague, then London, and later Paris, surrounded by galleries, collectors, and the business of art. But for Vincent, this wasn't the world of beauty and emotion he longed for. It was commerce, cold, mechanical. His passion faded. He grew moody, withdrawn, and was eventually let go. In London, he fell in love with a woman who rejected him, and the pain was sharp. This heartbreak, along with his increasing discomfort in the art world, began a new phase in his life, one marked by spiritual yearning. He turned to religion, hoping to serve something greater than himself. He trained briefly to become a minister, but failed his theology exams. Then he took up missionary work in a poor mining region of Belgium, known as the Borinage. There, among the soot-covered workers and starving families, Vincent tried to live like Christ, giving away his possessions, sleeping on floors, embracing poverty. The church saw this as fanaticism and dismissed him. It was another failure, another closed door. But in this darkness, something unexpected stirred. He began sketching the miners, the laborers, the people around him, not with polish or technique, but with empathy, with feeling. His pencil became a way to understand suffering, to reflect it, and perhaps to soothe it. At 27, after years of restlessness, rejection, and confusion, Vincent made a quiet decision. He would become an artist. not because it promised success or praise, he had no illusions of that, but because it felt like the only honest way to express what was inside him. His journey to art was not one of ambition. It was survival, a way to process the world and his place in it, to turn inner chaos into something others might recognize as beautiful. Vincent van Gogh hadn't yet painted a masterpiece, but he had found something even rarer: direction, and with it, the first true glimmers of purpose. Vincent's decision to become an artist didn't arrive with a bolt of lightning. There was no applause, no sudden sense of mastery. What came instead was effort. Hard, uncomfortable, relentless effort. He had no formal training, no academic pedigree, and no real support beyond his brother Theo, who quietly began sending him money for supplies and living expenses. But Vincent threw himself into the work. He studied anatomy, perspective, and technique with obsessive intensity. He copied sketches from old masters and filled notebooks with his own. Art became his full-time labor, mentally, physically, and spiritually. It wasn't a hobby. It was a necessity. His earliest works were dark and heavy. Deep browns, grays, and blacks dominated the canvas. They were not meant to charm. They were meant to tell the truth. Vincent painted peasants in the fields, old women in shawls, worn-out laborers hunched by firelight. He was drawn to the ordinary, to the worn and weathered faces of real life. One of his first significant pieces, The Potato Eaters, was a reflection of that vision. A family sits around a simple table lit by a single dim lamp. Their hands are rough, their expressions somber. You can almost hear the silence between them, feel the exhaustion in the room. Vincent believed it was honest, but the art world dismissed it. Too crude, too grim, too raw. He was crushed, but not defeated. Vincent wasn't trying to please anyone. He was trying to see. He once wrote, "I want to touch people with my art. I want them to say, he feels deeply, he feels tenderly." And he meant it. He wasn't just painting images. He was painting emotions, his own and those of the forgotten people around him. Throughout these early years, he bounced between towns and studios, living mostly in poverty. He rarely ate well. His clothes were often tattered, his health declined, but the more fragile his body became, the stronger his artistic voice grew. He was learning to speak with color, with texture, with silence. Though still unknown to the world, Vincent van Gogh had become something real, an artist not of technique, but of truth. His style was forming. His soul was pouring out. And though recognition was nowhere in sight, a storm of creativity had just begun to gather inside him. In 1886, Vincent van Gogh arrived in Paris, a city that pulsed with energy, art, and change. His brother, Theo, now an art dealer, welcomed him into his small apartment in Montmartre. It was cramped and chaotic, but for Vincent, it was a turning point. The Paris art scene was electric, and it would forever change the way he saw the world. Here he encountered Impressionism and its softer cousin, Pointillism. Gone were the muddy browns and dark shadows of his earlier works. In their place, bright colors, loose brushstrokes, and sunlight captured on canvas. For the first time, Vincent's palette exploded. He traded earth tones for yellows, reds, and electric blues. The gray skies of the Netherlands gave way to skies filled with movement and mood. He also met fellow artists Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, Émile Bernard, and Camille Pissarro. Among them was Paul Gauguin, a bold and confident painter whose relationship with Vincent would one day shape and shatter his life. Still, even in the lively cafes and bohemian streets of Paris, Vincent remained an outsider. Socially awkward and emotionally intense, he struggled to connect. He longed not for parties or praise, but for something deeper, understanding. He didn't just want to paint like the others, he wanted to feel differently, to see the world through emotion, not technique. His work became more experimental. He began painting self-portraits, dozens of them, each one capturing a shifting state of mind. In some, he stared directly at the viewer, challenging them. In others, he looked away as if lost in thought. These portraits weren't about vanity. They were a mirror of his inner turmoil. Though his art was evolving, so was his isolation. The noise of the city, the relentless pace, and the emotional weight he carried became too much. He grew tired, agitated. He needed peace, space, light. And so, in early 1888, Vincent left Paris behind and headed south to Arles, a quiet town in Provence. He imagined it as a kind of sanctuary, a new beginning, a place where he could paint the sun, the wheat fields, and the warmth he so desperately craved. He didn't know it yet, but Arles would become the stage for his most iconic works and his most painful unraveling. When Vincent arrived in Arles in February 1888, the cold Mistral wind was sweeping through the town, but Vincent didn't mind. He had come chasing sunlight, and soon the landscape would bloom with color. Yellow wheat fields, violet mountains, blue skies, everything he had imagined. He rented a small house with lemon-colored walls, the now famous Yellow House, and declared it the beginning of his dream, an artist's haven in the south of France. His plan was simple yet grand. He wanted to build a studio of the South, a shared space where like-minded painters could live, work, and inspire each other, a creative brotherhood. Vincent believed deeply in community, even though he often struggled within it. The solitude of his past made him crave connection, and in Arles he hoped to finally find it. He painted with manic energy, sunflowers in a vase, fields under heavy skies, blossoming orchards, starry nights. His brushwork became more confident, more alive. He no longer painted what he saw, he painted what he felt. The warmth of the sun became a fierce yellow on the canvas. The stillness of a room became a swirl of emotion in color and line. Despite moments of joy, the loneliness lingered. He wrote letters to Theo constantly, describing his work, his meals, his mood swings. Vincent was always trying to explain himself, as if hoping someone, anyone, would truly understand what was going on inside him. In the autumn of 1888, Paul Gauguin finally arrived in Arles. Vincent was ecstatic. At last, his vision of an artist commune seemed possible. He filled the Yellow House with paintings, decorated Gauguin's room, and prepared for days of creative collaboration. But the dream quickly cracked. Gauguin was independent, proud, and often dismissive. Vincent was emotional, anxious, and deeply sensitive. Their personalities clashed. Conversations turned into arguments. Vincent grew more unstable, afraid Gauguin would abandon him. And yet, despite the tension, he created some of his most memorable work during this time, including the iconic sunflowers, which he painted to welcome Gauguin. Vincent was holding on to something fragile, a dream built from loneliness and color. But underneath the surface, something darker was brewing. The pressure, the fear, the desire to belong. In Arles, Vincent reached new heights of brilliance, but the higher he climbed, the more unsteady he became. By the end of 1888, the atmosphere inside the Yellow House had become unbearable. What began as a hopeful collaboration between two artists had descended into daily conflict. Gauguin found Vincent unpredictable, overly emotional, and difficult to work with. Vincent, in turn, felt abandoned, anxious, and increasingly paranoid. The creative harmony he had dreamed of was unraveling before his eyes. On December 23rd, after a particularly heated argument, everything changed. That night, Gauguin stormed out. Some say he intended to leave Arles for good. According to one version of the story, Vincent followed him into the street, possibly holding a razor. But Gauguin walked away, and Vincent, alone and spiraling, returned home in a state of utter distress. He took a blade and cut off part of his left ear. What drove him to do it? No one knows for sure. Perhaps it was grief. Perhaps it was a desperate act of control in a world slipping away. Perhaps it was a cry no one had yet heard. He wrapped the severed ear in paper and brought it to a nearby brothel, handing it to a woman named Rachel. Then he collapsed. The next morning he was found unconscious and rushed to the hospital. Word spread through Arles that the local artist had lost his mind. Crowds gathered outside the hospital. Newspapers reported the incident. Gauguin left immediately for Paris. He and Vincent would never see each other again. While Vincent recovered physically, his mental health became increasingly fragile. He suffered hallucinations and memory loss. He would cry without knowing why. He begged Theo to visit and wrote letters filled with confusion, sadness, and shame. Despite everything, he continued to paint. In the hospital courtyard, he found solace in small things: a garden, a bench, a moment of light. He painted the courtyard of the hospital in Arles, self-portrait with bandaged ear, and the Red Vineyard, the latter being the only painting he ever sold in his lifetime. But something had broken, not just in his mind, but in his heart. The yellow house, the dream, the sanctuary was now empty. Vincent was alone again, surrounded by whispers, watched with suspicion, his place in the town no longer welcome, and so, with sorrow and consent, he committed himself to an asylum. The ear was gone. The friend had left. But the artist remained. In May of 1889, Vincent van Gogh admitted himself to the Saint-Paul de Moselle Asylum in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence. The stone building surrounded by gardens, olive trees, was once a monastery. Now it became a place of healing, or at least a place of quiet. For Vincent, it was both a prison and a sanctuary. His room had bars on the windows. There were long periods of silence broken by distant cries from other patients. His days were filled with routine, meals, medication, rest. But whenever he was well enough, he painted. The asylum staff allowed him a studio space, and Vincent used it obsessively. He painted the view from his window again and again. Cypress trees, swirling skies, golden fields. He painted flowers, corridors, and the hills beyond the asylum walls. And in a moment of uneasy calm, he painted one of his most iconic works, The Starry Night. The painting wasn't meant to be realistic. It was emotional. The sky pulses with motion. The stars burn like fire, and a quiet village sleeps below. Vincent called it a failure. The world much later would disagree. Though his mental health fluctuated, his creativity surged. He completed nearly 150 paintings in a year, many now considered masterpieces: irises, the olive trees, the bedroom, and wheat field with reaper. Each a blend of peace and chaos, light and suffering. But he was never free of the darkness. He experienced terrifying episodes, periods of confusion, panic, and silence. At times, he couldn't remember what he had painted. Other times, he feared his mind was slipping away forever. He once swallowed paint and turpentine, an act of self-harm that left him weak and shaken. Still, he held on. Throughout it all, he wrote letters to Theo, page after page, filled with thoughts about color, brushwork, emotion, and hope. He tried to explain the unexplainable, what it felt like to fall apart while creating something beautiful. Despite everything, he believed in his work. "What would life be," he wrote, "if we didn't have the courage to try anything?" Within the walls of that asylum, Vincent was broken, and yet in those same walls he created some of the most powerful art the world would ever know. A man losing his mind, yet finding his soul on every canvas. By May of 1890, Vincent van Gogh left the asylum in Saint-Rémy. His health had improved, and though still fragile, he was eager to return to the outside world. At the suggestion of his physician, he moved to the quiet village of Auvers, just north of Paris. It was peaceful, filled with open skies, winding paths, and golden wheat fields, landscapes that suited him. More importantly, it was near Theo. Theo, his brother and lifeline, had recently married and become a father. Vincent was happy for him, but he felt a quiet fear growing. Fear that he might become a burden, that the financial support, the emotional weight, the worry he caused was too much. He never said it outright, but his letters hinted at it. His tone had changed. Gratitude was now laced with guilt. In Auvers, Vincent was under the care of Dr. Paul Gachet, a physician with an interest in art and melancholy. Vincent painted his portrait twice. "He's sicker than I am," he wrote to Theo, half joking, half serious. But despite his doubts and inner turmoil, Vincent was painting more than ever. In just 70 days, he created more than 70 works: fields under stormy skies, roads lined with poplars, a church twisting slightly as if seen in a dream. Each painting seemed urgent, vivid, powerful, heavy with emotion. He was pouring everything he had left onto the canvas, and then it stopped. On July 27, 1890, Vincent walked into a wheat field carrying a revolver. No one knows exactly what he was thinking. Maybe he believed his time had come. Maybe he believed his work was done. He shot himself in the chest, but survived the initial wound. Staggering back to his lodging, he was found bleeding and taken to bed. Theo rushed to be by his side. They spoke little, but the bond between them needed no words. Vincent, in pain but calm, whispered his final message: "The sadness will last forever." He died in Theo's arms 2 days later. The village buried him beneath a tree-lined hill, surrounded by the very fields he had painted. At the time of his death, Vincent van Gogh was unknown, uncelebrated, misunderstood. But in that silence, a legacy was just beginning to rise. Vincent van Gogh died believing he had failed. He sold just one painting in his lifetime. He was laughed at, misunderstood, pitied. The world never knew what to make of him until it was too late. 6 months after Vincent's death, Theo followed him. He died from illness, grief-stricken and exhausted, never knowing the impact his brother's work would one day have. But Theo's wife, Johanna van Gogh Bonger, stepped into the silence. She inherited hundreds of Vincent's paintings and letters, things most would have discarded, but she didn't see them as failures. She saw them as truth. Quietly, steadily, she began to share Vincent's story with the world. She organized exhibitions, published his letters, and connected his art with the soul behind the brush. What was once dismissed as madness began to be recognized as genius. The world that had turned its back on him began to listen. By the early 20th century, Vincent's work had found an audience, then a following, then a legacy. Museums displayed his pieces, collectors fought to acquire them. Artists named him as their greatest inspiration. Critics rewrote their histories to include him. And with each passing decade, his name only grew. Today, the Starry Night hangs in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, seen by millions. Sunflowers is considered one of the most recognizable paintings in the world. His letters, deeply human, painfully honest, are studied not just for their insight into art, but into the human condition itself. But Vincent's legacy isn't just in brushstrokes or museums. It's in the way we see pain and beauty now, in how we talk about mental health, isolation, sensitivity, and creativity. He showed us that struggle and genius are often intertwined, that even in despair, we can create something luminous. He is perhaps the greatest example of someone who wasn't celebrated in his time, but whose time eventually came. Beneath a quiet hill in Auvers, Vincent lies beside Theo. Two brothers forever linked, not just by blood, but by belief. Theo never stopped believing in Vincent, and now neither have we. From silence came color, from suffering, beauty, and from a lonely life, a voice that still speaks softly, powerfully to the world. From sorrow and rhythm came something beautiful.